Welcome to Getting APIs to Work. And today we say hello to Mr. Open Banking, Eyal Sivan. Hey, Eyal. Thanks for joining. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Eric.
I like your name. You're Mr. Open Banking. Why are you Mr. Open Banking? Tell me about it.
Well, honestly, there is a whole story there, but I liked the idea that when people were having conversations about open banking, they could say, "Oh, open banking! You've got to meet this guy. He's Mister Open Banking." Um, uh, that it really the name came from that simple sort of joke.
It is pretty good branding, definitely. So that then naturally leads to the question, if that is good branding and open banking is something people want to talk about and they want to have a mister for, what is open banking? Give us your pitch of what open banking is and why it matters and why it needs you.
Sure. Thanks for the softball. What is open banking? This is a question that, even though we're several years into this whole discussion, a lot of people still sort of struggle with. So I have a definition that I gravitate towards that seems to hold, and it is this. Open banking is about the development of a common standard for the financial industry, a common, open, shared standard that anyone can use, but nobody owns. That everyone who's participating in the financial ecosystem, the banks, the fintechs, insurers, anybody who's dealing with financial services, they adopt this standard. Now, what that practically means is that when you need account data, or you need transactional data, or you need to issue a payment to move money around, no matter which organization you are dealing with, you speak to them the same way. And once that standard is in place, that leads to incredible network effects and creates the foundation for incredible financial innovation. Now, I want to point out what I didn't say. I did not say the word regulation. A lot of people say open banking equals regulation. That is not the case. There are a lot of market-driven environments, notably the US, Singapore is another one. Whether you're market-driven or regulatory-driven, you're still after the same goal, a common, open, shared standard for the secure exchange of financial data.
That is a very nice, but it also is actually a more narrow definition that I thought you would have. And like for me, what I find interesting is that you talk about a standard. In my understanding, right, open banking or open other things just mean openness, right, in general. So it is open. It's something that I can use, that where somebody exposes an interface for me to interact with, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a standard. So I'm just curious, why have you settled on this definition that is, I would say, quite a bit more ambitious than maybe what others would say, where it's just about opening things and not necessarily doing so through agreed on standards, like complete standards, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is true that oftentimes when you talk to people about open banking, they take a different view of what the open in there means, often gravitating towards this notion of data ownership, where, oh, what we mean by open is that the banks don't own this data, that it belongs to you, and you should be able to sort of take it with you and for it to be portable, and that ultimately they cannot prevent you from having that data. I want to be clear, that's very much in the spirit of open banking. That's sort of part of the definition. But
it's a much more modest view, right, so to speak, where you say, well, you can get it. It's like these things, right, where you can get your data from Facebook, but they will give you like 1,000 Excel sheets and you have your data, but there's nothing you can do with it because it's very, very hard to understand what it means. So
exactly.
I see your point. So it is, but it's an interesting difference that you're making there.
And I want to point out that you can have it the other way too. You could have a system where the data was very, very portable and based on a common standard, but you didn't necessarily have enshrined this notion of data ownership, right? You could imagine an open banking regime where the banks still own the data, but still the whole ecosystem supports a common standard, and you can speak to any bank the same way, and they're essentially commoditized APIs, etc. I would submit that even that environment would lead to incredible financial innovation, even if the issue of financial ownership, data ownership per se, was secondary. I don't want to make light of it. It's a massively important issue, especially as we get into the future of open data. But strictly speaking, the exciting thing about open banking for me is this notion of a common standard.
Okay, no, that's it. I like it when people have strong positions. It's like it gives you a little bit more to chew on, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So with all this momentum going in this direction, I'm wondering, like, what are the biggest sort of uncertainties and kind of question marks that organizations have nowadays? Where, like, what does that mean for me if I'm a financial institution, right? It's like I may understand that, but what does it mean for me? What do I need to do? What do I need to be prepared for?
Yep. So let's broadly define the players without using any arcane open banking acronyms. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but generally speaking, you've got these sort of fintech aggregator types on the consumer side who are the ones using all of this data that open banking suddenly opens up, right? It says, hey, banks, open up your data using this standard. So you've got a bunch of new companies sucking up this data and creating new kinds of experiences at the front. Now, of course, these players are thrilled about open banking. They can build whole new businesses with wonderful new data that is suddenly made available to them, often by regulation, creating these wonderful new experiences, often creating enormous fortunes in the process. On the other side, you've got, again, oversimplifying, the incumbent banks, the deposit holders who have the accounts, they have the customers, they have the scale, and they are often the subject of these these regulatory forces that say, you're not innovating fast enough, you've got to publish these APIs, you're on the hook for that, and you've got to give away your data is often how they perceive it. Now, that side, they're the ones who often struggle with this. Why would I do this? What's the business benefit to me? Explain to me the reason I would invest any cent more than what's required to comply in order to go down this road. So I think that both of those groups have to be cautious about seeing this as such a black and white game. But remember, you're in two different businesses. It's one thing to own that glass and own the relationship. It's completely another to be the bank behind the scenes.
And to me, that sounds very much like this typical idea of open innovation, where, the idea is that in these ecosystems, often fueled by technology of different players, that open innovation gives you new business opportunities. But of course, it also means that you're just playing in a different way. And I think open innovation, really in its purest form, as it was proposed by Henry Chesbrough, right? It really means it's something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, right? Because you do have to relinquish a little bit of control. And I think that is what, in particular for those institutions that have had the complete control over, 100 years, right? That's a little hard to swallow sometimes. Absolutely. But it still may play out as you said, right? But like in the end, you still get something out of it. You just don't get all of it, but you get something out of it.
Yes, and it is exactly that situation where you've got these institutions that have been dominant in their respective economies for 100, 200, 500 years. That's a really, really long time. But at the same time, those institutions moved with the times as well. It was banks that introduced ATMs. It was banks that introduced credit cards. In this notion of moving where their customers are and trying to serve them with banking services has always been at the heart of what banks are trying to do. What is the business that a bank is really in, right? A lot of people immediately jump to money. Well, they take deposits, they lend that money out, they make spreads. And that's, of course, true. But why did people give them those deposits in the first place? The answer is trust, right? The business that a bank is really in is the trust business. That's why you let them hold your money rather than keep it under your mattress. I would submit that banks are still in the trust business, even as they go through this disruption. The only thing that changed, and it's a big thing, is that the thing I'm depositing with you as a bank, the reason I need your services, what I'm trusting you to do, is no longer to protect my money. It's to protect my data. And that notion of bank as a data custodian, where money is one kind of data, but there are other kinds of data, such as my consents, my relationships with fintechs, my identity. I want to keep trusting those same institutions that I trusted before to provide me with those kinds of services. But this notion of bank as a custodian of trust in an abstract sense is quite different than the way banks think of themselves today.
So that points to, I would say, a very interesting and very foundational issue, right? Where you're saying that trust is, trust is probably one of the most fundamental things for economy, for society, right? It's a really, really foundational thing. And if you're somebody who can deal with trust, who can provide trust, right, that is something that is extremely valuable. So is that something where you say that in the end, open banking is almost like it's too narrow in its focus, or how do you see that?
I think if someone looks at open banking and thinks, oh, this is just about banking, or even worse, just about banking regulation, then they've completely misunderstood what's happening. I think open banking is inevitably the beginning of a much, much larger trend. And it's great that it's starting with banking, because you need banking as the foundation of commerce, right? If you're going to build something where lots of people are going to interact and trade their respective skills and services and goods with each other, well, it's great to have some sort of mechanism underneath that allows them to conduct that commerce without really having to worry about the mechanics of how it works. So, of course, you need a foundational way to be able to move money around digitally, to be able to message each other securely digitally, and pull data together digitally. But the other very important aspect that open banking introduces is this notion of consent. And now we come full circle to the data ownership. Now, I remember I said, for a definition of open banking, you don't necessarily have to have data ownership. But think about what open banking trains people to do, right? What open banking essentially says, and I want to stress that this will happen whether or not you have an explicit law that says you own your data. Simply by the act of me looking at my phone and saying, yes, I agree, this third party is allowed to access my banking data, and I consent to do this. And because this is my banking data, I'm not going to treat this the way I treat Google accessing my Facebook. I mean, this is my bank account. So I'm going to take this very seriously, and I might actually read the warning, and I am going to keep track of exactly what this relationship looks like and whether this consent is held. And I'm going to expect that the bank carries liability, whether there's a breach around this data. So I'm going to get used to this. I'm going to get used to sharing my bank data with my healthcare provider, with my insurance provider. Then I'm going to ask the next obvious question. Well, wait a minute. If I can do this in this way that I now completely understand with my banking data, why can't I do the same thing with my healthcare data? Why can't I do the same thing with my energy data? And for that matter, why don't I have this same rigor and control and liability wrapped around my social media data? And suddenly, people's eyes open to what it means to be part of this open data ecosystem. And they start to understand the importance of consent and consumer permissioning and the value that their own data generates. this is a world that, we both work at Axway. I'm allowed to say Axway, right? At Axway,
yes, you are.
Right. So at Axway, we call it open everything, right? And I think that's a great term, because that's very much where we're headed. Open banking is the thin end of the wedge. Already, you're starting to see it turn into open finance officially in a couple of regions now. You're seeing in places like Australia that it's already gone cross economy from the beginning. They call it the consumer data right, and they're getting into energy and healthcare. And you start to see the contours of this new world emerging, where suddenly I have data and I have to sort of take care of it because it's important data. It's not just my cat pictures and stuff. Like, this is my healthcare data and my financial data, data about my home.
So what you're saying is that the kind of open banking will trigger this kind of an awareness of a proper way or a different way how we actually can and should handle our data?
I hope so. Perhaps I'm being overly optimistic, or maybe even naive, but yes, I do think that is the case.
I'm not sure. I don't think it's optimistic or naive. I think it's just no. I think it is a bit optimistic. Yeah. Seeing how people treat their data nowadays, I think it is a little bit optimistic. But I think you are definitely onto something. I think that once you get to, much more fundamental things, that's like my savings, right? My retirement. It's like, I mean, these things are a little bit different than saying, I don't care if somebody knows my friends list or not, right? That's, yeah. I think that these are on little different levels of importance.
It's like I reflect on my own usage of these digital tools, of which there are now many, and it's a big part of all of our lives. And I think about how I, say, read emails that give me Facebook activity notifications or, news alerts, versus how I react to something that says my credit report changed, or something from my bank that says, oh, we noticed this subscription. Could you please verify that this is a legitimate subscription? I do pay more attention to that data. I am a little more worried about that data. And I think that that's what we're sort of living through, If, like me, you've been at this internet thing for a while, then you know that there's always been sort of two kinds of data, if you like. There's the sort of the internet stuff, right? Like the photos and the emails and whatever, the HTTP world. And then there's this, before the internet ever showed up, there was data before that, from like 1970 to 1990. And that stuff, just, you get really worried whenever it touches the internet, right? That's your bank data and your mainframes and your, old router backends and stuff. And it's almost like what we're living through now in open banking, as I said, is the beginning. It's like it's starting to merge, right? As all these old systems move to cloud, and suddenly you're going to move towards these SaaS models, and suddenly this data that used to be in this silo starts to get out there, maybe for other reasons. Those two worlds are starting to come together.
That is a really interesting thought. I don't know exactly how to continue it. I would need to think about it. But like this idea of, there used to be data even before there was the internet, because it was important enough that people managed it even without the internet, right? And nowadays, a lot of this stuff just exists because, well, why not? But that's a very different motivation, I guess. So maybe that's a good kind of an Occam's razor. It's like, would this data still exist without the internet? And if it did, it's probably important.
Right. I think that's a great way to put it, right? The sort of classic I remember in computer science books about expert systems, they would talk about air traffic control data, right? And how ultra critical it was. Obviously, people's lives are at stake, and how you would never treat that like internet data. let's say that's, absolutely not allowed, not cool. You're starting to see those lines blur, right? Where even the most critical of data, the most secret of data, the most protected of data is moving to the internet, along with the controls that are necessary to make that possible.
So maybe to wrap this up a little bit, because I think, we have a lot to talk about and probably more than we have time today. But I see you have thought about this trajectory kind of for the long haul, and I find that fascinating. But then again, there also, I think, both you and I, when we work with organizations, right, we also sometimes see a little bit shorter term issues around adjusting even to this trajectory, right? Like, okay, even if you accept this story of, okay, this is where things are going, how do we get there, right? How do we even get started? So I think what would be great if you could just talk very briefly about what do you see, and like when you see the long story ahead of yourself or ahead of the industry, what do you see right now as some of the blocking things that maybe are still holding things back a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. We are now at a point where most of the technology pieces that you need to do something like this, let's call it open banking, a financial ecosystem supporting a common standard for the secure exchange of data, it exists. There's a few different options. They're proven at scale. The security protocols that go with them, that buttress them, continue to not only improve, but become more and more de facto standards incorporated into open banking flows. So the attack surface, as they call it, is sort of being reduced. So I think one thing is, don't presume that the tech is somehow dangerous or not there or increasing the attack surface or introducing some systemic risk or something like that. I think the evidence is pretty clear that, if anything, you're reducing systemic risk. Right now, there's huge systemic risk from screen scraping, from brittle bank systems that are not super great at security. By everybody moving to these common standards that have incredible security standards buttressing them, you get better, not worse. So first, don't be afraid of this stuff. It's actually good, right? You'll be more secure, not less. And it's not like there's missing pieces. There really aren't on the technology side. So that's one. The second sort of challenge, I'd say, is we do. When I say we, I mean sort of the globe. I'm referring to all open banking regions everywhere. Have to develop some sort of credible liability framework. So even in regions that adopted open banking, you can still have breaches that cause the liability frameworks to break down. So if you look at the Wirecard breach that happened last year, next thing you know, billions of dollars are just gone. They're just missing. So some sort of mechanism to determine risk and liability, perhaps with insurance mechanisms built into it, perhaps with the governments of these regions underwriting some sort of common insurance policy, or maybe taxing the incumbents to do it. This is a big part of the challenge that has yet to be developed. Without that, it's going to be very hard to build something that is sustainable and has the confidence of the large players who are, at the end of the day, the large deposit holders. So that's a second thing sort of holding us back. The third is really just a mindset shift. At the end of the day, banks out there have to understand that they can't be all things to all people. Regular consumers of financial services want these new fintech apps. They want these new financial products and capabilities that are offered to them through these tools. They want to increase their own wealth. They want better ways to move money around. They want better ways to invest. There is no putting that genie back in the bottle. It's there. It's done. That game is over. So you better get on with that mindset shift of tearing down those silos, recognizing that you are not all things to all people, and figuring out how the heck are you going to participate in this new open world. Because it's not optional. You can't keep up that walled garden strategy forever. It's just not going to work. So I think the third big thing holding us back is that more of the larger banks have to go through that mindset shift. Some of the largest ones in the world already have, to realize that we are moving to this open everything world, whether you like it or not.
Okay. I like this idea of first having to change your mindset. But now we can kind of get to, the part where we look forward a little bit to like our next conversation. It's like, now let's assume you've done that. And now you want to get it done. So in your experience, where do you see some problems in that space?
Yeah. So that's a great segue to the next talk that we're going to have. Execution. So it's one thing to go through that mindset shift, to your point, but even if you have the leadership, you have the willingness, you even have, let's say, the cultural change that's necessary in terms of thinking of this open future, how do you actually execute on that strategy? How do you start to get specific? How do you approach your API program? How do you structure your teams? What's important to have in place from an infrastructure point of view? What's important to have in place from a delivery process point of view? All of that gets into a larger world, which is digital transformation. This is a journey that banks in particular have been on now for, what are we at, 20 years, right? Like a seemingly nonstop amount of time, easily since the internet came along, maybe even before, if you look at PC banking, etc. So keeping up with even what digital transformation means can be a challenge, because that changes. It's, you hear this term continuous improvement, and indeed that's what it is. So I think that's a great segue to our next talk, right? To explore the different pillars that make up digital transformation, and how an organization can apply that lens to everything they do, and how, at the end of the day, thanks to open banking and the larger open everything movement, that digital transformation is accelerating, and it has switched from being something optional that you maybe could be a little laggard about, a little lazy about, to something that is absolutely critical for an organization to survive as we move into the 21st century.
Yeah, and for this, I think for this execution aspect, right? It's something, what I find so interesting is that even though maybe open banking is special because it has like some of these foundational aspects that maybe not all other areas have, but I think the general challenge of not just understanding where you want to go, but also knowing how to actually get there. I think that is something that is just something that you see in all these organizations that you talk to. I mean, I speak a fair bit to, for example, car manufacturers, right? And it's just amazing to see. It's like, I mean, these companies are well functioning and they create great products and they're still successful, but they also know that they have to change, and they know it, right? But knowing how to do it then and actually doing it are two very different things after that. And I think that is really fascinating.
I agree. I mean, that question of how do you manage change, how do you lead change, is something that is more than just a technology question. And I'd love to get into it with you.
Okay, and we will do that, but we'll do that at another time. Eyal, I'd like to thank you for being on my channel, for talking to us about open banking. I think it's a really important and interesting topic, and I really liked your take on looking at something that is so foundational that it's may even mean that we look at all of our interactions with data and the way how we treat data in a different way. I think that's a very interesting perspective of the whole space.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Okay. Bye, everybody, and see you soon.